this works?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Start when you start.
All right.
It's set for 1, 6, and 7 on the...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Goal for the government today is to take steps to seriously address climate change in the international community. Quickly, I'll address the status quo of the problem, outline the model for the government today's debate, and outline 2 points or 2 contentions. One is the importance of treaty signaling and norms, and the second is how this treaty is key to actual climate justice. Quickly, in the status quo, we see that the Kyoto Protocol is all about developed countries limiting their greenhouse gases. It doesn't really take a huge step towards acknowledging climate change in its entirety, but it just addresses greenhouse gases in developed countries. Also, the majority of countries are parties, but they aren't bound by any targets. That they kind of are. It's a symbolic gesture that they are. They believe in this idea, but they're not limiting their own industries to the targets of the Kyoto Protocol. Developed countries such as China, Brazil, actually all throughout South America, Europe, and Asia are these same countries. However, they aren't bound by it, nor have they ratified it. And the U.S. is particularly a key country where they are a signatory country, but they haven't ratified it whatsoever. And this deals a huge blow to the symbol of the treaty, and I'll get to that in my first point. Very quickly, climate change is what's happening right now in the status quo. It's causing developing countries to face the effects of climate change, that they are bearing the brunt of climate change from these developed countries. Now, the model for today's debate is that the U.S. will not only sign, but they will also ratify the Kyoto Protocol as of the latest amendment and making the Kyoto Protocol binding on its targets on the United States. So the first point is that the importance of treaty signaling and norms in the international community. Treaties are set a signal to other nations to join into the international community. We've seen with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, even though nations have what realism would posit in international relations, nations have an interest into having nuclear warheads and nuclear weapons. It's in their best interest to join the international community and to disband or not to have nuclear weapons and join the NPT. You see, this is actually better in the long run. This is a better signal. This causes a norm cascade of norms. What a cascade of norms is that realism would posit that countries are out for their own self-interest. However, when the international community finds that there's a norm that is in the best interest for all states will abandon that self-interest that realism would find is true, but then they would take up and join the international community, and it will cause a cascade of norms in which, excuse me, countries will start joining, for example, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and now we get to a point where that's an embedded norm in our international community. It's something that you will not infringe upon or go back upon. It's a treaty, and it's not very enforcing if you think about it. Countries can just back out of the treaty at any time, but we've seen that so ingrained in the international community that we find it very beneficial, not only for ourselves, but for the entire world. The U.S. is a key state to creating these cascading norms. The United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, the EU, and all of the countries in NATO pretty much follow the U.S. example. The U.S. is a steward in the sense that whatever the U.S. does, these other countries, these huge influential countries, also follow suit. So it follows that once the United States follows through with a treaty such as the Kyoto Protocol and actually ratifies it, it gives it legitimacy in the sense that it's something that the international community should also pay attention to. And the United States is a key agent and key state in triggering these cascading norms. And so, because the United States is not, in the status quo, has not ratified it, that's kind of delegitimized the Kyoto Protocol. And states really don't see the Kyoto Protocol as something to take seriously, even though it is probably in our best interest to actually do as the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So with signaling and ratifying the binding targets as the model articulates, that's key to the cascade of norms. And that once all these countries are, as I articulated in the status quo, they're signatory countries, but they aren't bound by any of the targets. They aren't really taking these. They aren't taking any of these targets seriously. So they're not adjusting any of their industries. They're not adjusting any of their markets. They're not adjusing any of their GDP or economies into binding their targets for addressing greenhouse gases. And because if the U.S. ratifies it and takes it seriously by binding it to its own economy, other countries will also see that this is something that's in their best interest as well. And they're not losing out on anything because they see another country, such as the United States, binding themselves. I'll take your point, Mike.
Yes, sir. If the Kyoto Protocol is substantially harmful to the U.S. economy, how does that reflect in, you say other nations follow the U.S. example. If they see the U.S. hurting in trying to mitigate this climate effect, how does that bring?
Yeah, sure. Two answers. One, there's no evidence that's substantially hurting the U.S. economy, like it's going to cripple the United States. There's no warrant for that whatsoever. And two, even if it were substantially harmful, like I've already articulated with the Non-Proliferation Treaty example, that it's against the interest of a country to give up its nuclear weapons. However, we've seen that it's probably in the best interest in the international community to give up those interests. That even though it may harm it with nuclear weapons being a defensive mechanism, a deterrent, they're still going to give it up. So, regardless of whatever the effects are of joining the Kyoto Protocol, we see in the long run it's better for the international community. So, through the model, by the U.S. not only signing but also ratifying and being bound to the Kyoto Protocol targets, we see that other countries are going to see this as not only the United States taking that hit, but also these other countries are going to take the hit for the name of legitimizing these treaties and making it a norm in the international community, and finally taking greenhouse gases seriously. My second point is that this is key overall to climate justice. Right now in the status quo, we see that developing countries are bearing the brunt of climate change. We've already seen the negative effects in the Philippines that they're seeing in a Category 5 hurricanes almost every time they have, or not hurricane, tsunami, not tsunami,
Earthquake?
no, what's the, not a hurricane, but what's it?
Typhoon?
Typhoon.
It's the same thing.
I know, but like that's what they call it there.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, so yeah. So Category 5 typhoons. Every time they have a typhoon, this is becoming climate change. The change in temperatures on Earth is exacerbating the conditions which lead to an imbalance of temperatures that cause these Category 5 typhoons. I don't know like the science behind it, but countries like the Philippines, countries in Eastern Asia, these developing countries are begging these developed industrialized countries to change their greenhouse gas emissions because it's affecting climate change so much. But these developed countries are ignoring this call to action because, as Mike so points out, there's this perception that changing their greenhouse gas emissions will somehow change their economy. So it's in the sense of a bottom line. They don't want to affect their bottom lines, and the countries don't want to hurt their GDPs. But by signaling the importance of the Kyoto Protocol, greenhouse gas emissions from the developed countries, which is what the Kyoto Protocol explicitly tries to target, this will actually start taking steps to seriously address climate change that will make countries actually acknowledge that this is a problem. The United States is taking a stance and actually doing something about greenhouse gas emissions, which are changing the climate. That's causing these developed countries to ask developed countries to finally change their practices. And through this model, we see that we'll not only have boost the importance of trading those cities in the international community, but also it's a key to climate justice, and that it will finally make other countries actually acknowledge the importance of their greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Critical theory.
Shut up.
Here on Opposition, we are striving to mitigate the harms of climate change while retaining a functioning economy in this country. The issue with the Prime Minister's speech is his goals align with ours. Right? We all recognize the seriousness of climate change, its effect in the third world, and how we need to take drastic measures to mitigate this effect. The problem is, and the lack of analysis, which should be blatantly obvious coming out of the Prime Minister, is why did the U.S. not sign the Kyoto Protocol? Right? When all other industrialized nations have made this commitment to greenhouse gas emissions, but the U.S. withdraws, are we just so self-conceited to say that, no, you guys take care of climate change, we'll sit out? No, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the economical impacts on the United States and how the Kyoto Protocol does not make sense for us looking forward in how we mitigate climate change. So let's look at the U.S. dependence on coal and oil as the number one non-renewable resources that our economy is fundamentally established on. And in fact, we are just behind Russia in our dependence on natural gas. So my first point will be on how the Kyoto Protocol is not the U.S.'s solution to climate change. My second will be our alternate options and how we as a country move forward. So, to jump right in, the Kyoto Protocol is a three-tier protocol in our reduction of greenhouse gases. It is estimated that in the first tier of this greenhouse gas reduction, it would cost the U.S. economy $400 billion and 1.5 million jobs. The IPCC cites this as a 2 to 6% reduction in our overall GDP. So there are the concrete numbers, Prime Minister, that you were striving for. So, the problem is the Kyoto Protocol is not the way the U.S. should address this, right? The U.S. has cited several reasons. One is an economic reason for not wanting to join, but also the fact that in establishing this Kyoto Protocol, it's weak in its attempt to appease all other nations, right? It is weak on the developing countries such as China and India because of the simple fact that the Kyoto Protocol is striving for a 5.2% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 levels. The reason that's weak in China and India and too strong in the U.S. is because no one is as large of a producer of greenhouse gases for as long as a producer as the United States.
Shane.
This would be a substantial burden on our economy, one that we do not need to bear in order to mitigate climate change. There are alternate options that we should take, and that's going to be my second point. The U.S. should be looking to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, right? We're not arguing that there should be a blanket ban on touching our emissions. It's just that this Kyoto Protocol does not make sense. Instead, we should look at alternate options. We should look at carbon sequestration. We should look at sulfur aerosols in reducing our climate effects and in reducing our impacts on the environment as a whole, right? For the United States, we need to take a strategy that makes sense for us. So to be clear, the distinction that we are making from the government side is that they see the Kyoto Protocol as the U.S.'s solution to climate change, but that is not the case. There are other options that we can take. There are better options for our economy, and to interface with what the opening government is saying about how other countries look at the U.S., for example. If we sign this Kyoto Protocol, sure, maybe we bring some legitimacy to the protocol as a whole, but the problem is then they look to us for an example as how trying to change our economy to mitigate greenhouse gas greatly hurts us. And then we fall as our power, we fall as a global influence. Sure, I'll take back half.
Right, so in the IPC report that you're referring to, it was actually talking about how the economic lull is going to be caused with the transition to more sequestering and other practices that allow for the decrease in carbon. So what you're actually offering is the same type of solution that's going to allow for a lull in economic growth.
Right, not as substantial. So you're right. Our economy is going to have to suffer to some degree if we're going to shift away from what has brought us to this point. Right? The problem is the Kyoto Protocol does not make sense for the United States economy. That is a lack of analysis that you're coming out of the government side. You say, oh look, all these other industrialized nations. Well, on opposition, we're telling you why the U.S. specifically it does not make sense for the U.S. to join this referendum. Okay. Furthermore, there are a number of things we can do besides just these drastic climate reductions, right? We can set the precedents for other nations in terms of things like moving to more renewable transportation methods, right? We can still be that global icon for mitigating the risk of climate change through other means, other than this cap-and-trade system that Kyoto Protocol talks about. And since I just flagged that, I'm going to mention that very briefly. There is an ability in the Kyoto Protocol to trade carbon limits between countries for the first tier, but this was taken into account in those first estimations I gave you. So regardless, the burden on the economy is still there. That we would be damning our economy $400 billion in this first tier. Remember, there's two below this, and it would cost us 1.5 million jobs. So, finally, I want to bring to you an example of something I'll like to tag as bamboozled, right? I think this will really wrap up our case very succinctly. In climate change, it's very easy to look at one source and say, look, we could just do this, we'd be totally solved. We can move to one other method, it would be done. The example of bamboozled is this new upsurgence of bamboo, and saying that, look, if we just used bamboo for toilet paper, if we just made bamboo plates, because it grows so fast, we're fine. We can use this renewable resource indefinitely. The problem with this is it misses the larger implications, and this interfaces with the Kyoto Protocol because it's missing the larger economic impacts. Right? When we harvest bamboo, in order to do so on an industrial scale, we do it in large monocultures. And we're largely sourcing this material from Asian countries where they're cutting down forests in order to plant this bamboo. Right? These are the larger impacts that the opposition is bringing to to you that the opening government blatantly ignores. Thank you very much.
Whenever you're ready.
Andre, back up.
The leader of the opposition gives these arguments that ultimately the Kyoto Protocol is bad for the U.S. economy, that we shouldn't sign it because it's bad for jobs. He glosses over it without really giving any human impact to it whatsoever. He just talks about numbers. But quickly, I'll just go over some rebuttal over his really just one point. I don't know what the second point really had to do with anything in this debate. And then I'll get into the split about how this is really climate justice is really a debate over haves and have-nots, the have and have-nots. So his first point, again, was that the United States isn't a signer or didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol because it was so bad for economies. That back in the 90s, that the levels then would have put us in so much of a bad position somehow that, I don't know, there was no impact to the leader opposition's debate. That we would lose so many jobs, we would lose a lot of money, it would hurt our economy, but there's no impact whatsoever. Are we going to, lose our place in the international world? Are we going to die? Or is Russia going to take over? Is Canada going to, invade? There's no impact to this argument whatsoever. And also, the leader of opposition concedes that if we're going to take serious steps to address climate change, it's going to affect our economy. And we totally agree. Yes, it's going to affect our economy, and we totally agree with that because this is a sacrifice to the greater good. If you want to make great strides in actually addressing this existential problem, such as climate change, in which the entire planet is at risk, you're going to have to take some sacrifice, and it's going to take some removing yourself from some complacency. Like, we're going to lose some jobs. It's going to suck for us. Ooh, wah, wah. We have to actually take some serious steps. We can't just say it's going to hurt the economy. Let's just turn a blind eye to millions of people that are dying because of climate change. His second point was that there's other ways to address climate change. Something about bamboo. I don't know what's going on with that one. He didn't really articulate or go on with that. He said something about sequestration, but again, I think that just goes back to the idea that if this affects the economy, it's something that we're going to have to do. But also, I want to flag that in a bit. I'll take a bit. But I want to flag that this has implications for this idea of this, or the split of the idea of the haves and have-not. That the haves want to prioritize what they have over actual human beings. That they want to, they feel like they have a better connection to their material well-being rather than human beings of the other worlds. That the have-nots are just going to be collateral damage to the haves of their material being. Before I continue my split, I'll take one.
Let me clarify, because you seem to have a hard time listening.
I do.
The impacts that you're bringing up are not exclusive to the Kyoto Protocol. My second point was that there are other ways we can do it without damaging the economy. Your plan brings across additional harms not necessary.
No, so what the model was, the incredibly handsome Prime Minister articulated, was that by doing this, by ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, it's a step towards signaling other countries, not the United States taking climate change on its back on its alone. It's an international problem in which other countries are going to see the United States taking steps towards it, and it's taking the steps towards it causes that cascading of norms, and other countries are going to follow suit with it. It's not going to take the United States entirely to be the Superman of the world like we so think the United States is. I'll take a bit. But it's going to take the entire international community to finally address climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. I'll take your point, Ken.
Can you provide an example in which cascading norms have been successful in the past?
Yes, so non-proliferation treaty I already articulated then. Also, when it came to genocide in the African American countries, Amnesty International actually began investigating these genocides, and that led to putting pressure, IGO pressure, onto these African countries. Why did I say African countries? Putting pressure on these African countries. There was a cascade of norms that other countries acknowledged that this genocide in African countries were a bad thing. IGOs came in and started investigating this. Absent Amnesty International's interrogation, investigation, there would have been no norms to acknowledge that this genocide is bad. This was back in the 90s. So this is a huge precedent. This is a huge tenet in international relations. Now going on to this split very quickly, that addressing climate justice is really a debate about the haves and have-nots. And the Prime Minister was getting there, but he didn't have enough time, and so I'm going to fully try to elucidate this point. The developing countries, again, are bearing the brunt of climate change. The Philippines, East Asian countries particularly, are experiencing these Typhoon 5, level 5 typhoons on an average basis, on a normal basis when it comes to their typhoon season. In the past, it really hasn't been this severe. It has been severe. However, think about the Philippines. They are a developing country. They don't have the resources like the United States does. They don't have the resources like even developed countries are bearing the brunt of climate change, like Australia, when they had the hottest summer this past, our winter, the hottest summer there ever because of climate change. And also in the United States, look at us. We had the polar vortex in which we felt and increasingly low temperatures. Many people die from the polar vortex. But imagine the Philippines, which they don't have the resources to address level 5 typhoons. We've already seen Hurricane Katrina, well, wasn't a level 5 hurricane, but it devastated Louisiana. Imagine the Philippines, in which the Philippines is Louisiana, but like much worse. It's going to devastate them even more. And it's just blind hubris. It's blind ignorance and blind arrogance for the United States politicians, even people, to say climate change isn't happening. My temperatures are fine. I'm not feeling anything. Go out of the United States and look at other countries. Go to Australia. Go to Eastern Asian countries. Go to anywhere else in the world and acknowledge that climate change is a big thing, and it's happening, and it's hurting these developing countries. Not now. It's hurting these developing countries the most because they don't have the resources. They are the have-nots of the international community, and it's the haves that are being so arrogant and have the hubris to say, "Oh, Kyoto Protocol, as good as it may be, it's going to hurt our jobs." Like, I'm not going to have a job. It's going to be bad. Like, the economy's going to be bad. I'm not going to get, like, my investments. Like, that's plain hubris to acknowledge that you're going to put a priority on your bottom line rather than other countries, other people that are dying every day because of the greenhouse gas emissions, which the Kyoto Protocol can't solve. Oh, sorry, I was going to take the point. And so, this is call to action from all the developing countries. I forgot what the conference was. It was a couple months ago in which there was a protest against. It was, I think, some economic talks. I forgot what it was called. I'm bad. But the developing countries were literally pleading to the developed countries to take serious steps to address greenhouse gases. And none of these developed countries took any steps whatsoever. They didn't bind themselves. They didn't take any responsibility. In fact, these developing countries don't emit as much greenhouse gases as the developed countries. The developed countries are the ones that are responsible if you look at it in the long run. That's why this is climate justice. But why it's so important is because it has implications as to egalitarianism in its entirety, that allowing the have-nots to have a claim to the haves is bad overall, or seemingly bad overall. But if we can acknowledge that this has real implications to real life of people living, climate change Climate change hurts real people. If we take steps as the Kyoto Protocol, and as the model does, take key steps towards addressing greenhouse gases, we can finally address climate change in a serious tone instead of brushing off the have-nots of the world.
Whenever you're ready.
On the opposition side, we agree that global warming is bad. But what we disagree on is that the Kyoto Protocol is the solution to this problem. The government has failed to bring up why specifically the Kyoto Protocol is the uniquely exclusive to fixing climate change, because we don't believe it is. We believe that there are parts of this that are actually more harmful, and that mitigating climate change could be done in a more effective and beneficial way, not only for the U.S., but for the world as a whole. My partner Mike came up here and he's a roadmap. Okay, first I'm going to talk a little bit about what Mike said and explain why the Kyoto Protocol does not solve these problems, and then I'll do some refutation about what Andre said, and then I'll have a little mini split thing.
What is that mini split going to be?
That countries participating in the Kyoto Protocol are not actually doing what they should be doing, kind of, and they're cheating. Okay. So, like I said, we agree that climate change is bad, but we don't believe the Kyoto Protocol is the right way to do this. So Mike got up here and he told you how this would be extremely detrimental to the U.S.'s economy. And this is because they call for a 5.2% reduction in carbon emissions from 1990. Since then, China, who is the #1 emitter of fossil fuels in the world, they have increased at a much faster rate than the U.S. We industrialized before them, and so our 1990 emissions are much higher than that of China. So this solution, I'll take you at this point. So this solution is weak because it's not holding China to as high of a standard as it's holding the U.S. So it's hurting the U.S. while it's not hurting China when they are emitting, more fossil fuels than we are at this time. Yes.
Two things. One, 1990 levels are a comparison of the specific country, so it's only based off of that country's 1990 levels that they have to gradually decrease. Second of all, 76% of the companies within China are actually owned by the United States, so it would be under their jurisdiction to decrease the carbon emissions within China for those MNCs.
Here.
Right, but that would still hurt the U.S. economy is our point. We agree with that it's because it's the 1990 levels specific to each country. But yeah, China's 1990 levels were a lot lower than they are now in comparison to what the U.S.'s was because we industrialized and emitted more fossil fuels at that time. So Mike told you these alternative options that aren't going to hurt the economy, can actually help the economy, right? They're going to create jobs, create innovation. They're going to he gave you the example of carbon sequestration, and this is where the ocean actually absorbs the carbon dioxide. So it actually absorbs the carbon dioxide, and this is a solution that doesn't stifle the economy in the way that Mike told you, right? This could lead to economic stagnation, where there's increased poverty, increased unemployment, people are losing their jobs, people are starving, people are dying. It's bad. The economy in the U.S. not hurting is bad, not good. Yeah, I'll take it.
So why are things like carbon sequestration uniquely exclusive to your side of the house? Why can't they function on our side of the house as well when we sign the Kyoto Protocol?
But we're saying that what is agreed to in the Kyoto Protocol is not exclusive to carbon sequestration. It's putting other limits and other things that aren't doing that are hurting the economy. But this, as an alternative, is better than what is outlined in the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, so why? So then Andre gets up here and he says we need to make this binding. And he says because countries will all abandon self-interest and work together for the greater good. Okay, that's a very idealistic approach that's probably not, very true, right? Like, countries aren't just going to abandon their own self-interest and say, we're not going to emit any more fossil fuels, or we're going to reduce our fossil fuel emissions, because we trust that everyone else is going to do it. The UN comes out with these goals, and they come out with these standards, and they impose it on these countries, and nobody listens. The U.S. has ratified many of these, and they still haven't been listened to. So what about the Kyoto Protocol is going to be more enforcing than previous things the U.S. has come out with, right? That the UN has come out with, that the U.S. has ratified. There's no enforcement in this. Even if it becomes binding, there's no enforcement. It's still going to be that all countries are going to do this in good faith. But when not everybody's doing it in good faith, nobody's going to put themselves out there when the other countries aren't putting themselves out there. Countries aren't just going to, not this time, abandon their own self-interests, and they're not going to hurt themselves when not everyone is participating in that. And you say, the solution is make it binding, but there's still no enforcement. It might as well not be binding, right? So the UN has put out goals and standards that have not been met, that the U.S. has signed and the U.S. has ratified. So I don't understand how the U.S. doing this is actually going to make it any better. And a lot of the harms that Andre brings up about, the environment and why we think climate change is bad is not exclusive to fossil fuel emissions. We have killed a lot of we have a lot of diverse ecosystems because we've plowed, we've paved, and we've transformed 40% of the non-ice land in the United States. We've put roads and sidewalks and killed all these trees. That's really bad too. And the Kyoto Protocol doesn't solve for that. Our population is only going to get bigger and bigger, which is going to cause for more and more of these kinds of actions. And this, the Kyoto Protocol does not solve for these kinds of solutions, right? We should plant more trees. That's a good solution for the economy, as well as, I'll take your point for it.
Yes. Is that okay? So sure, we don't deny that there's other ways you can also solve it, but I think the only thing that the government has to prove, the opening gov, is that our model actually takes some serious steps to address it. That's what the model does. When you take serious steps, and that causes the cascading norms of which other countries will abide by. We don't have to solve every problem, just this one problem.
And what we're saying is that your plan doesn't solve for this problem, and it's not. You have to show why the Kyoto Protocol is specifically the good answer, and we're saying that it's not the good answer, and then these are our reasons why it specifically is not the right answer. So a lot of these countries that are participating in the Kyoto Protocol right now are getting into emission trading schemes where they're still producing the same amount of fossil fuels, but they're just trading with other countries. So this is no long-term solution. What is this solving for? None of this money, none of this innovation is investing in the future where we can use non-fossil fuel energies. We're not investing in that. We're just continuing to produce energy and then trading it. So that's not, Kyoto Protocol is not solving.
Ready now?
Yeah.
Can you just hit the start button? I think it does. The goal of the closing government team is to bring about a multinational approach to climate change
we believe that multilateral cooperation is going to be the main driver of a more practical way to address climate change problems across the world. We're going to bring you 3 arguments today: why international approaches work, why curbing global carbon emissions on a global scale is important, and see why the United States signing the Kyoto Protocol actually benefits the United States both internationally and domestically. But before I get there, I'd like to just bring you 2 points of rebuttal, which I feel like should be sufficient enough to counteract the last speaker's case. The first argument that the Deputy Leader of Opposition makes is there's no unique reason for the Kyoto Protocol, that there's no real efficaciousness of the treaty itself. I have 3 answers to this. First, it will be beneficial for the United States and the world, economically, ecologically, and in terms of health. And I'm going to expand on that in my 3rd point. The second argument is that even if it's not a unique driver or of effective change, it does not prevent nations from continuing to take additional steps to prevent global climate change and address its problems. What this means is that just because we sign the Kyoto Protocol does not mean that all other options stop. Addressing climate change is not a zero-sum game. We don't just take one step. We don't just take one action. This is one step along a long road to fight the effects of climate change. My 3rd argument is that the argument that the Deputy Leader of Opposition makes about enforcement being the main driver of why the protocol is not effective is problematic only because enforcement only comes after the treaty becomes binding. You can't enforce a non-binding treaty. That's why they're not binding, which means that in the case under the model that the Prime Minister lays out, when it becomes binding, enforcement follows, which will answer back a majority of the offense that the upper house addresses. The second argument that they make is that this is not the only method, but I already answered this above. And these are really the only 2 points we get coming out of the Deputy Leader of Opposition. There's probably a reason why you're going to prefer my analysis here. So let's look at why international approaches work. Let's look at the Montreal Protocol. And this is going to answer back the member of Opposition's POI about cascading norms here as well. So the UN sponsored a treaty in the 90s to eliminate the usage of chlorofluorocarbons in production and manufacturing as an attempt to prevent further damage to the ozone layer within the stratosphere. The ozone layer being critical to protection against UV rated humans and agriculture, which would in turn cause severe health problems and decrease in food production. So because all these nations had a vested interest in protecting their interests in health and productivity, an international approach was viable. Similarly, in the Kyoto Protocol, the reason it failed is because the U.S. thought it was not in the best interest to engage with the treaty. This is the same logic we get coming out of the Leader of Opposition here, and it's going to be a reason why in my next argument here is going to change. So what has changed? 65% of Americans now believe that accelerating climate change is anthropocentric. 98% of scientists back a similar model, and the IPCC has released a new report demonstrating in detail climate change's effects. So why do we care? Because now it is more popular to support climate change than ever, and it demonstrates that it is not political suicide for American politics. This was one of the main concerns for the original projections, right? Not right now. Because the same kinds of economic articulations were coming out of huge oil-backed funds and think tanks which drove the same kind of logic that moved the United States away from the Kyoto Protocol in the first place. So now to my second point. Why? Before I move into that.
So it has nothing to do with popularity, right? It's how our economy functions. You can't say someone's opposed to a position when their job's going to be removed from it, right? It doesn't matter if they support it or not.
I understand, but clearly you haven't been watching the news talking about what's going on with Obamacare. Popularity and perception within the media totally drives policy because the numbers that we see coming out of different articulations and different political positions are radically different. What we're saying is that the politics and popularity of climate change drove the economic arguments which influenced the United States' decision. So, the second argument I'm going to make here is why curbing carbon emissions on a global scale works. This is going to answer the Leader of Opposition's argument that this doesn't work for the United States. But the problem is that just we're looking at the United States doesn't actually solve. So one of the primary drivers of global climate change is from carbon emissions and the processes associated with energy production. It's not just the burning of fossil fuels themselves. This means that coal mining, timber harvesting, hydraulic fracturing, coal and natural gas burning, and waste disposal all contribute to pollution, which leads to decreased drinking water, lowered food production, increases in respiratory disease, increases in infrastructure damage, and human damage via extreme weather events. These are all kind of the implications that occur when we continue to utilize high carbon emission and high damage actions associated with those carbon emissions. However, these piecemeal approaches that the opposition is bringing you really don't work. Pollution knows no borders. One of the basic ecological precepts is that everything has to go somewhere. So what this means is that tar sands in Alberta, Canada pollute drinking waters in the northwest United States. Chinese and Japanese pollution affects Southeast Asian air quality and United States air quality. Without an international approach, these effects will fail. Not at this time. So now my third argument, why the U.S. signing the Kyoto Protocol actually benefits the United States. And this is where we're really going to want to pay attention. The United States loses about 15 acres a day, 15 acres of wetland every month due to climate degradation. Places like the Everglades in Florida, the Mississippi Delta of Louisiana, and the East Coast, right? These are places that are rapidly losing wetlands. Wetlands provide fishery habitats, tourism, ecological diversity, and protection from floods and hurricanes. They are critical portions of the United States economy where people rely on to make their living. Investment and development of different technologies to combat, investment and development of different technologies to combat global climate change is aimed to bring about 200 million jobs and $2.3 billion in revenue in China, as they shut down 17,000 coal plants to bring about thorium reactors online in 5 years, and the usage of wind and solar energies. This has a parallel in the United States because of the same kind of explosion with green energy markets. Now, what this means is that though there might be some damage in some sectors if we adopt the Kyoto Protocol, other investments, other innovations, and other jobs will begin to arise as a reaction to the Kyoto Protocol. So that means that at the end of the day, it will end up being necessarily beneficial. And this is going to subsume the leader of opposition's argument that a U.S. approach like sequestration will work, because those things are happening within the United States now, and they will continue to happen at an accelerated rate under the Kyoto Protocol, which means we actually drive more and more productivity and more economic beneficence. And to close, standardizing top-down approaches on a global level are the most effective way to move forward. And the U.S. participating in the Kyoto Protocol would be the end of the biggest holdout to the Kyoto Protocol. China and Brazil are already signatories, and India is trending the same way because the effects which drove China to go green in the first place. Getting the United States to sign is the last piece of the big five polluters in the world to stop holding out and to do something serious about climate change. Thank you.
The United States is not willing to sacrifice their sovereignty in order to sign an extremely flawed treaty. I'm going to start with the points of rebuttal and then move on to 3 positive points of material, including the lack of proof of global warming, flaws in the treaty itself, as well as the coal industry being demolished and the effect that will have on America. To start with my points of rebuttal, the government comes up here and gives us this kind of a flawed reasoning. They say looking just at the United States does not solve this CO2 emission problem. But then they say we need to look to the United States to sign this treaty so that other people will follow. So they're wanting to, de-emphasize the focus on America, as well as putting the emphasis back there again. You're out of order. Additionally, so what we're looking at is that they can't help. The United States will not be able to help not only other countries, because it's also mentioned that the U.S. is being arrogant and not wanting to help these other countries. They're only focused on their own needs. Well, guess what? The United States is not going to be able to help any country when they themselves are poor, unmotivated, and in need of aid. And that is what this treaty very well could lead to with the economic downturn that the opening team did a great job of illustrating for us, not at this time. So to move on to my positive points material, we here on the opposition side agree that there is an abundant amount of information that global warming is here. It is not definitive. We are putting the United States in a position to sign a treaty that we still are lacking proof of, what exactly it's going to be solving. And so then we're going to go into, okay, let's say it is definitive, which it's not, but let's go. This treaty is flawed. We want not only see loose restrictions for India and China, but also what happens when it's broken. So to expand on the restrictions on India and China, this is going to create this treaty being ineffective in the long run. I'm going to give the example of the law that was passed for California oil refineries. that oil refineries in California are spending billions of dollars updating their systems in order to limit the amount of pollution that they are emitting. Well, guess what? Oregon, Washington, Arizona, they have not all adopted this same law. So what this means is while California is suffering high gas prices and other economic hardship, our air is still polluted. Other states have not shown any signs of following. We do not know, not at this time, we do not have any proof of these other states continuing. So not only is California, who's already in an economic hard spot, we're seeing further economic hardship by trying to start this whole, maybe other people will follow, and we've yet to see it. Not at this time. We've yet to see it. So that's where we're emphasizing here. By the U.S. signing this treaty, there's no proof that other people will follow. We're setting ourselves as an example, and we're the ones who are going to be hurting from this, and that's a risk we are not willing to take because we see, as the opening government has pointed out, there are other options, and not at this time. And additionally, we're going to look at how the coal industry is going to be completely demolished in the United States. This is about to diminish about 5 million jobs, if not more, in the United States. And though the government comes up here and says that other jobs will come up through innovation and greenhouse, well, where's the motivation? These coal workers, they don't have the skills and the greenhouse and the new energy that we're seeing. How exactly are those people going to be shifted to those other jobs? The government does an extremely poor job of illustrating how those 5 million people losing their jobs are going to be secured other jobs. I'll take your point now.
Okay, so the idea that the coal industry is just going to disappear is, first of all, uniquely ridiculous. But second of all, the innovation that we're talking about are things like carbon capture technology, which removes the carbon out of the coal during its burning, which means that the innovation is going to be in developing technologies, which is where the jobs are going to come from, not that the jobs of the coal workers themselves are going to disappear.
We believe that the government stating that it is ridiculous that that it will completely disappear is in itself ridiculous because in the treaty it states the exact amount of emissions that we can have, and we see the amount of energy or emissions that are given by coal. So we know there are the extremely large percentage of jobs that are not at the side that are going to be lost, and this industry is, if not demolished, going to be completely cut in half and broken, and that is not going to recover, and those jobs are not going to recover, and there's going to be a unmotivated workforce, and it's going to kill the economy that we're seeing. Yes, I'll take you at this time.
Okay, yeah. If I'm going to have to pay, I'm going to have to pay a couple cents extra for some gas prices because a lot of people lost their jobs. I think it's better in the long run that we're going to have a signal that the U.S. is an example to help the have-nots in their daily lives. I think having to bear the brunt of economy here is much better than the have-nots.
The point that the opposition is trying to make is that us paying the small amount of gas prices because other people will follow is great if other people actually followed. We aren't seeing it, and we're also suffering the pollution that we're seeing in this gas example in California. So all of these sacrifices that we are making aren't even benefiting us in our own state, and that is the state that the United States is going to be seeing. So to kind of sum up what here on the opposition side is stating is that the United States is risking their well-being and their sovereignty to make these decisions on to how exactly they would like to go about cutting CO2 in order to sign a treaty that has many issues in it. That the opposition is not saying that we shouldn't be working and striving towards cutting down CO2. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that this Kyoto Protocol Treaty is not the way to do it. We are not saying that CO2 should not be addressed. We're saying that the flaws in this treaty clearly lay out why the United States should not sign it.
We get two primary arguments out of the member of opposition. First, this idea that sovereignty of countries should never be sacrificed in order to have some type of regulation of carbon emissions and pollution control. And Ryan actually answers this for you in his speech when he starts talking about the fact that pollution knows no boundaries. We're not concerned about whether or not countries are being deprived the ability to develop in a way that we want. We're more concerned about whether or not this is increasing environmental degradation, whether or not this is increasing pollution in countries that are outside of your own borders. And we're saying that this is an international approach that we are taking in order to make this a community that is healthier, safer to breathe, and less polluted for everyone on the planet. And we say that individual sovereignty is not something that outweighs these costs. The second thing that they bring up to us is this idea of a flawed treaty. We get a lot of rhetoric talking about how Kyoto is so flawed and we can't do anything about this. But Ryan also gives you this response before they even speak. When Ryan talks about how enforcement only comes after agreements are binding, how can we expect to enforce standards or create treaties that are improve the issues of Kyoto if we don't even have people signing on to it to come to the table and talk about the best practices to make sure that we're actually controlling pollution and making this preserving the environment? So these are all things that we still get on our side, and they've done nothing to demonstrate why we can't do these things on our side. But there's a bigger issue that I think needs to be addressed, and it's this economic hardship that we get out of the opposition, probably one of the strongest arguments that we get out of the opposition. And we're going to actually look at right now in terms of why this is why they're flawed on their argumentation on this. So out of the opening opposition, we get this idea that we shouldn't sign the Kyoto Protocol because it will hurt economic growth within the United States. But let's actually look at why economic growth is slowed based off of the IPCC report that he was referring to, right? Changing business practices, increasing conservation, changing production, going into actions of sequestering are all things that mean that you now take a business that's been up and running and telling them that they have to change the type of machinery that they use, they have to change their level, the type of materials that they use, because these are all things that decrease pollution. So what does that mean? When you have a transitional period when businesses are changing the things that they do to run and operate, of course, they're going to have lower production yields. They're going to have slowed production costs. We're going to have fewer factories. This means that there will be a slow in economic growth. But we support that slow in economic growth because it means in 2 to 5 years from now, we have controlled climate. We have less environmental degradation. We have better conservation of resources. And we say that this is a slow that we need in order to get us to a point that is more beneficial. Why is this important? Because if we do not provide any type of means of demonstrating that we're setting a standard to have this type of control and regulation, you're only going to get an exacerbated issue of increased pollution or be in the same situation of China. What does that mean? In 2008, China spent $33 billion to demolish and greenify one city. They called it a second development because China was on the path of developing dirty with coal, and now they're trying to redevelop with green. And we see that there is more money that's actually spent and more resources wasted when we don't set that precedent in the early stages of development or early stages of business practices, determining that we care about the environment. So what we're actually doing on our side, Mr. Speaker, is we're providing incentives for companies to go green. We're providing incentives for companies to be sustainable in how they develop and their business practices. And this is what we get on Kyoto, and they give no incentive on their side to not develop dirty. And that's what we advocate on our side. Yeah. So let's actually look at I have 2 points of summation that I want to get into. I first want to look at this idea of why Kyoto is significant. Opening opposition tells us that Kyoto is not the best solution for the United States, and they want to take on these actions of carbon sequestering or other types of means. So let's actually look at this, right? I have 2 responses. One, sequestering is not banned under Kyoto, because if you are a signatory of Kyoto, it is up to you to determine how you're going to decrease your carbon emissions. So if they want to engage in sequestering, we can. So we don't think that they actually get to win this argument on their side. We get it on ours as well. But the second response that I have to this is to why the United States should be signing on to Kyoto is because of this multilateral idea of multilateral treaties. And this is something that Ryan brings to you and is never responded to. It's not just about the United States combating climate change. It's about the international community combating climate change and controlling for carbon emissions. And we provided you an example of this. Ryan brought to you the example of the Montreal Protocol in the 1990s, where it was one of the first international treaties to recognize the use of countries taking an international and multilateral approach in order to combat carbon emission, or in order to combat CFC emissions. Why was this good?
When you had the international community taking a stance on no longer using CFCs, we had an international approach to preventing or slowing the depletion of the ozone layer. This was a stance demonstrating the fact that the international community was working together in order to help each other and have it a safer environment for everyone. This is the impact that we provide to you. That we need some type of international and multilateral approach in order to decrease carbon emissions. This is what Kyoto gives to us. But without the United States signing on to it, we have a more difficult time reaching this end goal of making a better environment for everyone. Why? Ryan tells you that when Canada pollutes, the United States suffers. Ryan tells you that when China pollutes, Japan suffers. Ryan tells you that when the United States pollutes, Haiti suffers. It's this idea that there is no boundary for pollution, and that when you have the international community standing together, agreeing that they won't engage in certain actions, this means that we can actually make it a better environment for everyone. Points?
Okay, so we tell you that the Kyoto Protocol puts a cap on the amount of emissions that countries can do, and instead of investing in non-fossil fuel energy sources, they're conducting emission trading schemes, right? So they're not investing in the long-term solutions that you're advocating for under the Kyoto Protocol.
So first of all, cap and trade is not something that's under Kyoto, but if that's a policy that the United States wants to adopt, they can. And we see that fossil fuel development is something that is highly dirty, is something that would be changed under this policy, right? But let's actually look at this type of the impacts of signing for this, right? Because of this idea that pollution knows no boundaries. When the member of opposition comes up here and talks to us about California policies with oil refineries and how Californians are paying high gas prices but are still breathing polluted air because Washington and Arizona don't adopt these policies, I ask you, what is the solution? Is the solution that we all of a sudden stop regulating oil or not regulating refineries? No. The solution is adopting some type of national level of regulation to make sure that everyone is using the same type of regulation policies and preventing the pollution. And that's what we get under Kyoto. This idea that we need the international community to work together so everyone is taking the same exact stance and guaranteeing that we're not increasing environmental degradation and increasing coal uses in developing countries and elsewhere in the world.
Thank
All right. No, it's part of it, but you don't have to.
Ready?
No.
We in closing opposition believe we need a quality solution to solve climate change, a legitimate problem in the modern world. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to bring you the case that the treaty is flawed, like McKenna said, and also why there's a problem with signing bad treaties even if they have good intentions. Okay, so that's essentially our extension to the case. But first, let's do a summary of the round as we've seen it so far. Okay, so opening government comes up here, and they bring us 2 points. One is that the U.S. legitimizes the treaty, and that this is the key to climate justice. Okay, but first off, we don't think that there's anything good about legitimizing a bad treaty. And secondly, this whole point that it's like, well, this is still good symbolic action is addressed in our case very clearly. This actually has legitimate harms. Okay. Moving on, opening opposition comes up here, and they talk about how this hurts the economy. Now, Mike cites that there's 1.5 million jobs lost in the United States. The whole response on the Gov side is that, yeah, well, people need to suffer. People don't need to suffer. These are people's lives we're talking about here. Okay, you can't just dismiss this. These are people that are actually suffering. These are people that are losing their pursuit of happiness due to a specific problem. We think this is serious and shouldn't just be ignored. Okay. Furthermore, on closing government, they essentially bring you another 2 points. Okay, they bring up why we need a global solution, and then they also bring up this point that look, economics and the environment don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive, and these are both good points. We agree with those. Okay, there does need to be a global solution. And also, the economics and the environment don't have to be mutually exclusive. This is true. Neither of these are points why specifically the Kyoto Protocol should be ratified. They try and say that it's like, well, look, Kyoto will lead to innovation, okay? And this may or may not be true, but Mike gives you the specific numbers that are in the report that 1.5 million jobs will be lost, and this simply can't be overlooked in exchange for this whole sort of principle that, yeah, well, maybe innovation will happen down the line. We're not really sure. Hopefully it will happen when there's already hard data against this, okay? Now, leading into our extension.
Before you
Okay.
go on.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so 2 points here. First of all, he's completely ignoring the part where I told you in my speech that these innovations are already happening. But B, he's also missing. He's already missing the point where wetland degradation is already endangering even more livelihoods than it would, and will continue to do so unless we take action.
Okay, so this is essentially another problem with the Dove case, is that they spend so much time establishing that global warming is a problem. Okay. That doesn't necessarily say why the Kyoto Protocol is the specific solution that is actually needed. And this is what we're getting at in our case. Okay, that this treaty is specifically flawed, and here's why. It splits up the world between developed and developing nations. Okay, so under the Kyoto Protocol, developed nations would have specific targets that they would need, where developing nations don't. Okay, so anytime that Ryan Brick comes up here and talks about, well, look, China's polluting, this is hurting Japan, this is actually a point on our side of the house because Kyoto Protocol allows for that. What it does is it stops developed nations from hurting the environment, but it allows developing nations to, including China and India, okay? What we really need in global warming is a solution that brings us all together. We need a solution that puts the world together. This is the global solution that you guys are talking about, and Kyoto Protocol is not that solution because it splits the world up, okay? Portland can eat all the organic food they want, but as long as China is still spewing coal into the world is screwed, okay? And this has been seen by what McKenna was talking about, that China's coal emissions have greatly spiked throughout the 2000s. In fact, they use about half the world's coal currently, okay? So when McKenna comes up here and she's talking about, look, California can pass these laws, but Oregon doesn't. This is our sort of principle that we're talking about, that is underlined in the Kyoto Protocol, that there is no point in passing a solution for one part of the world and not the other. And that's exactly what you guys are bringing us, all these points that actually help our side of the house, but you disagree, Mr. Bryan.
Yeah, all of your rhetoric is this idea that this type of regulation doesn't work, so let's just stop regulating altogether. We're providing a solution that talks about how we're able to actually improve regulation, and you need to talk about why that's bad.
Okay, well, I think I've already given a lot of examples of why this regulation is bad, but you guys are sort of arguing this little thing that's like, well, as long as we can show that we kind of have some potential benefits somewhere down the line, this is a good thing and it should be done. And that gets into our specific overarching principle of why there's a problem with signing bad treaties even though they have good intentions. And the reason this is because it makes people think that the problem is solved when it actually isn't. Okay? This is the same sort of people that think that like racism is over because like Obama got elected president. Okay, here. Now, Ryan even admits it in his speech that he says, look, we know the Kyoto Protocol isn't perfect, but maybe down the line we can improve this. Okay, this is what liberals thought. Yeah, you did say that. This is what the video doesn't lie. This is what this is what liberals thought when Obamacare was passed. So many people voted for that because they were like, shoot, we couldn't get single payer, but maybe we'll pass Obamacare and then down the line we can get it. Well, now it looks like we're never going to get that, okay? These sort of little specific solutions that make us think that we have a solution when we don't is actually a bad thing in the long run. But you would disagree, Andre.
Yeah, this isn't a debate about all or nothing. This is a debate about whether or not we can actually take serious steps towards actually addressing climate change. Developed countries are ignoring this fact, and we find that the Kyoto Protocol actually acknowledges that this is a problem.
Here.
All right, we agree that you do need some sort of understanding that global warming is a problem. That is sort of a good thing. We think that the world is trending towards this. We don't think that the Kyoto Protocol is a be-all, end-all solution for this, and we actually think that it has more harms, like I've just laid out, because it makes people think that the problem is solved when it really isn't. And we think that this is actually like a big problem. This is the same sort. It's one of these things that it's a politics of distraction as opposed to like an actual real solution. Okay. Another example I can cite about this is that there were a lot of left-leaning people that didn't support the GMO food labeling bill in 2012 because they thought that what this would lead to is people thinking that the problem was solved. They voted against that in hopes that they could have a better bill on the ballot in the future. Okay, the Kyoto Protocol is essentially the Coney 2012 of global warming. Okay, we need a real solution for this, not some sort of fake solution that makes people think that, oh, global warming's been solved. We passed the Kyoto Protocol when really it hasn't. That's why we're proud to oppose. Thank you very much.